The sound of metal chains snapping across the water will haunt me for the rest of my life. At first, I thought it was just another early morning fisherman pulling in his catch. But when I stepped onto the porch, barefoot and half awake, the scream of an engine tore through the mist and rattled my chest. My eyes adjusted just in time to see a towboat cutting across the fog, its chains dragging something heavy behind it, something that glittered under the pale light of dawn. It took me 3 heartbeats to realize what it was. My boat, my second wind, the one thing that had kept me breathing since my husband died. I didn't think. I just ran. My feet slapped against the wet boards of the dock, cold water splashing up my legs as I shouted for them to stop. But they didn't. 2 men in neon vests avoided my eyes as the winch groaned louder, hauling my boat deeper into the lake. The air reeked of gasoline and salt, thick and raw as I grabbed the nearest rope and pulled with everything I had. The line burned my palms, the fibers cutting into my skin, but it was useless. The current, and their motor, was stronger. I slipped, fell to my knees and watched as the last piece of my piece vanished behind a wall of morning fog. Standing on the shoreline, clipboard in hand and an expression as cold as the water itself, was Grant Lewis, our HOA president. He didn't move, didn't blink, just stood there watching me fight like it was entertainment. The same man who had smiled at me 2 months ago when I moved in, who told me, "We keep things peaceful around here." Now that smile was gone, replaced with a smirk that made my stomach turn. I shouted at him, asking what gave him the right. His only response was a slow glance toward the men towing my boat, followed by a single nod, like a king signaling an executioner. "Noise violations," he said calmly. "You were warned." "Noise violations?" I gasped. "Grant, I don't even play music out here. It's just me and the water." He lifted his clipboard. "The board received 3 complaints last month regarding disturbances on your property." His voice was measured, almost rehearsed. "Repeated disturbances of community tranquility. Your boating privileges have been revoked effective immediately." The words didn't even sound real. "Community tranquility?" I repeated, my voice breaking. "You can't just take my boat." But he could. And he did. Because that's what power looks like when it hides behind rules and paperwork. The contractors finished securing the tow line, and one of them, avoiding my eyes, handed me a folded notice before stepping back onto the motorboat. I opened it with shaking hands. "Permit revoked. Repeated disturbance of community tranquility." The ink bled slightly where my wet fingers touched the paper. My throat tightened. I wanted to scream, to cry, to throw the notice into the lake, but I couldn't move. The morning felt too still, too cruelly quiet. Even the birds seemed to have gone silent, as if the whole world was holding its breath, waiting to see what I would do. I looked around for help, for anyone, any neighbor who might come down and tell me this was wrong. But all I saw were blinds shifting, curtains twitching, faces that disappeared the moment I turned their way. No one wanted to be part of this. No one ever does when it comes to Grant Lewis. The dock creaked beneath me as I stood there trembling. My bare feet were soaked and numb, my hands streaked with rope burns. Somewhere deep down, something inside me snapped, not from anger, but from disbelief. This wasn't about noise. It wasn't about community rules. It was about control. I forced myself to stand tall, even as tears blurred my vision. "You had no right," I said, my voice low but steady. Grant took a step closer. The morning sun cut across his face, catching the faint scar above his eyebrow. A small reminder that he wasn't born to lead anything. He just learned how to act like he was. "You think this lake is yours, Rachel?" he said, his voice dropping to a whisper only I could hear. "Wait until you see what I really control." And just like that, he turned and walked away, his shoes crunching against the gravel path as if nothing had happened. The boat disappeared completely from view, leaving only ripples behind, circles spreading wider and wider until they reached my dock, lapping against the wood like the faintest reminder of everything I'd just lost. I stood there for a long time, staring at the empty space where second wind had floated every morning. My husband used to call her my anchor, because after he died, she was the only thing that kept me from drifting too far into my grief. Now even that was gone, pulled away by men with orders and a man who thought a title gave him godlike power. The sun rose higher, turning the mist to gold. The smell of motor oil still hung in the air. I picked up the crumpled notice, smoothed it between my fingers, and read it again. Every word felt heavier than the last. I didn't know it yet, but this was just the beginning. Grant Lewis had started a war he didn't understand, and he'd chosen the wrong woman to fight. As I turned back toward the house, something in the water caught my eye. A scrap of red paint, drifting near the dock. It was a piece of my boat's hull, chipped off in the struggle. I reached for it, the cold water biting my wrist. Holding that fragment in my hand, I made a silent promise. If they thought they could take what was mine, they were about to learn how wrong they were. But in that moment, I didn't realize how deep this fight would go, or just how much Grant Lewis truly controlled. The lake wasn't just water. It was a battlefield waiting to surface. And before it was over, every lie buried beneath its surface would rise with it. Before Grant Lewis ever showed up in my life, the lake had been my sanctuary. Now it felt like it was watching me. I used to believe water could heal anything. After my husband passed, that belief became my only lifeline. The day I first saw this property, sunlight shimmered off the surface like broken glass, and I remember thinking, this is where I start over. The realtor, a talkative woman named Mary Collins, walked me along the dock with a practiced smile and said the words that sealed my decision. "You'll have private shoreline rights, Rachel. Complete access, no restrictions." She made it sound like freedom came included in the mortgage. I signed the papers the same week, never imagining how false those promises would turn out to be. Those first few months felt like a second chance at life. Every morning before work, I'd sit on the dock with a mug of coffee, letting the mist roll over my bare feet. Loons called from the far end of the cove, and the only sound louder than their echo was the hum of my old radio playing softly beside me. Sometimes I'd talk to the lake like it was an old friend, telling it about the patients at the hospital, about how hard it was to sleep in an empty bed. When you lose someone, silence becomes a noise of its own, and the water was the only place that could drown it out. My husband, Mark, used to love fishing. Before he died, he made me promise that when my time came, I'd scatter his ashes somewhere peaceful. When the doctor said he didn't have long, I asked where he wanted to rest. He looked out the hospital window and whispered, "Somewhere you can still talk to me." A month after his funeral, I brought his ashes to this lake. I stood on the dock at sunset and let the wind carry him across the water. It shimmered like silver dust before sinking below the surface. Ever since, I've felt like he's been here, watching, protecting. That's why the boat meant so much. It wasn't just fiberglass and metal. It was my connection to him. Losing it felt like losing him all over again. It wasn't long before I met Diane Harper, the woman who lived 2 doors down. She was in her late 50s, with silver hair always tied back in a bun, and a garden that could have belonged in a magazine. The first time we spoke, she brought over a plate of blueberry muffins and said, "You're the new one, aren't you? You'll learn fast. Keep your head down, don't make waves." She smiled, but her eyes gave her away. There was something behind that smile, something like fear. One evening, I asked her what she meant. Diane hesitated, glancing around as if someone might be listening. "Everyone here learns sooner or later," she said softly. "Grant doesn't lose." The way she said his name, Grant, felt heavier than a warning. It was a confession. She told me that the HOA president had run the association for nearly a decade, and anyone who challenged him either moved out or learned their place. I laughed at first, thinking she was exaggerating. But the longer I lived here, the less funny it became. A few days later, I received the HOA's welcome packet. It arrived in a thick white envelope stamped "Community Harmony Through Order." Inside was a 50-page manual detailing everything from acceptable lawn ornament dimensions to a color-coded decibel chart for approved lake activity. According to their rules, even small motors and portable radios required noise compliance authorization. I remember reading that line out loud and laughing to myself. How could anyone measure community tranquility? Still, I filed the packet away, assuming it was just bureaucracy doing what bureaucracy does best, pretending to keep peace while quietly tightening control. That night, as I cleaned the kitchen and replayed the chaos of the morning in my head, I heard something slide across the porch floor. At first, I thought it was the wind. Then came the soft thud of paper against wood. When I opened the door, a plain brown envelope lay at my feet. No name, no stamp, just my address, written in a shaky hand. I tore it open under the porch light. Inside was a single photograph, grainy, black and white, clearly taken from a distance. My boat, second wind. The timestamp in the corner showed it had been taken 3 days before it was towed. For a long moment, I just stood there staring, the cool night pressing against my skin. Whoever sent it had been watching me, watching my dock, watching my life unravel before I even realized it had begun. And somewhere out there, maybe even right across the lake, someone was still watching. When Grant Lewis calls a meeting, you don't attend, you're summoned. That's what Diane told me the morning I found the notice taped to my door. The letterhead read Harbor Point Lakeside HOA in polished blue ink, but the tone was anything but polite. It ordered me to appear before the board to discuss repeated infractions relating to noise disturbance and community disruption. I almost laughed when I read it. The only sound that came from my dock most nights was the water brushing against the posts. Still, something about the language, the words must appear, made me uneasy. The community hall sat at the top of the hill overlooking the lake. By the time I arrived, a dozen cars already filled the gravel lot. Inside, folding chairs lined both walls, and a long wooden table dominated the center. Grant sat at the head of it, his silver nameplate gleaming under the fluorescent lights. He didn't stand when I walked in, didn't even look at me right away. Instead, he flipped through a stack of papers like a judge reviewing charges. Around him sat the other board members, people I'd seen walking their dogs, tending their lawns, waving politely. Now they all avoided my eyes. The air felt heavy, like the moment before a thunderstorm. Grant finally spoke. "Rachel Moore," he said slowly, drawing out the syllables. "Owner of Lot 14, Lakeshore East." He lifted a page and cleared his throat dramatically. "We've received multiple complaints regarding excessive sound levels and failure to maintain community harmony." The way he said those words, community harmony, made it sound like a sacred doctrine, not a vague policy written by overzealous neighbors. "I haven't done anything wrong," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You took my boat without notice. You had no right." He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. "The right," he said, "comes from the bylaws you agreed to when you bought your property. Page 14, Section 6. All members must adhere to standards ensuring collective tranquility. You signed it, Mrs. Moore." My stomach turned at how easily he twisted that phrase. "That doesn't mean you can steal my property." Grant smiled, but there was nothing kind in it. "No one stole anything. We repossessed a privilege you abused." He turned to the board. "See? This is what I mean about ignoring harmony." A murmur ran through the room, soft and cowardly. I glanced at the others, hoping someone might speak up. No one did. Not even Diane. Most stared down at their papers, pretending to read. I realized then that this wasn't a meeting. It was a performance, and Grant was both director and executioner. My pulse quickened. "You can't just take action without proof," I said, forcing my voice louder. HOA boards are required to provide written evidence before imposing penalties or revoking privileges. You never showed me a single complaint. For a second, his expression faltered. That was my first real glimpse behind the mask. The flash of surprise when someone he expected to scare decided to fight back. "You seem well informed," he said finally. "Maybe too informed." "I know my rights," I replied. "And I know you broke the law." A faint ripple of whispers moved through the room. Grant's jaw tightened. His fingers tapped the gavel resting beside him, slow and deliberate. I could feel his control slipping, and part of me wanted to push harder. But then his eyes met mine, and for the first time, I saw something darker there. Not anger, but intent. He rose from his chair and walked toward me, each step echoing against the floor. "You want peace, Rachel?" he said, stopping just close enough for his voice to drop. "Then you'll have to earn it." The gavel cracked against the table like a gunshot, silencing the room. And in that single sound, I realized something chilling. This wasn't about rules. It was about power. And Grant Lewis had no intention of sharing any of it. When people lie to your face, proof becomes your only weapon. After that meeting, after Grant slammed his gavel like he was sealing my fate, I realized words weren't enough. Arguing with him was like shouting into a storm. Loud, desperate, and utterly pointless. If I wanted to expose what he was doing, I needed something stronger than outrage. I needed evidence. The next morning, I drove into town and bought 3 small security cameras, the kind meant for wildlife monitoring. I installed one on the porch facing the dock, another hidden beneath the eaves overlooking the side path, and a third disguised as a solar light by the mailbox. Inside, I set up a small recorder near the window where I usually met visitors. I told myself it wasn't paranoia, it was protection. Still, I couldn't ignore how wrong it felt to turn my home into a surveillance post. I started recording everything. Every knock at the door, every visit from the maintenance crew, every friendly check-in from board members pretending to care. I kept a notebook by the kitchen counter and wrote down dates, times, and what was said. When Grant stopped by to remind me of upcoming HOA inspections, I pressed record before I even opened the door. He didn't know it, but every word he said from that day forward was captured on tape. Here's something most homeowners don't know. In one-party consent states, it's perfectly legal to record your own conversations, even if the other person doesn't know. As long as you're part of the discussion, the law protects your right to document it. I made sure to check the law twice before I started. Grant had taught me to read every line carefully, and I wasn't going to hand him a loophole to twist against me. At first, I thought the cameras would scare them off. They didn't. If anything, the harassment got worse. A week later, someone dumped 3 bags of rotting trash in my driveway. I found a note wedged between the garbage bags. "Clean up your act, Rachel." The handwriting was almost neat enough to pass for official correspondence. When I brought it to the next HOA meeting, Grant smirked and said, "Maybe you should control your guests better." Laughter rippled through the board. No one dared to defend me. Then came the noise reports. Again and again. 3 citations in 1 week for disruptive dock activity. The funny part? I hadn't even been home 2 of those days. One notice claimed I'd held a party after midnight. The footage from my porch camera told another story. My lights were off by 10, and the only movement came from a raccoon knocking over a bucket. I submitted the video as evidence, but the board refused to review it, claiming video evidence is not an approved appeal method. That line still echoes in my head. By the end of the month, I stopped opening my blinds. Every car that slowed down near my house felt like another warning. I'd lie awake at night staring at the ceiling, counting the seconds between the creaks of the dock boards outside. The sound used to calm me. Now it made my chest tighten. I began sleeping with my phone on record, the red light glowing faintly on my nightstand. One evening, as I reviewed footage on my laptop, I noticed something strange. The camera by the mailbox flickered out for exactly 42 seconds around 11:30 p.m. The same thing happened the next night, and the one after that. Whoever it was knew how to move just beyond the edge of the lens. It wasn't random. It was deliberate. The paranoia started to change me. Every knock at the door sent a surge of panic through my body. Even friendly faces looked suspicious. Diane tried to stop by once with cookies, but I couldn't bring myself to open the door. She called through the screen, asking if I was okay, but I just told her I was tired. She didn't press, and I was grateful for that. I didn't want her involved. Then came the night that confirmed everything. Sometime after midnight, I woke to a faint creaking sound. like slow footsteps across the boards. I held my breath, listening. It wasn't an animal, too heavy, too measured. Someone was walking across my dock. I slipped out of bed, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The red light on my recorder blinked steadily, the only glow in the dark room. I moved toward the window, careful not to make a sound. Through the thin gap in the curtains, I saw the outline of a man, tall, broad-shouldered, standing at the edge of the dock, staring out at the water. For a long time he didn't move. Then slowly he turned his head toward the house. Even in the shadows I recognized the shape of his stance, the squared shoulders, the authority in it. It was Grant Lewis, and for the first time I realized he didn't just want to control the lake. He wanted to control me. If you want to catch a liar, follow the ones who protect him. That thought kept circling my mind the day I saw the boat. It was a cloudy afternoon, the kind where the lake turns the color of steel. I'd been reviewing my porch camera footage when I noticed a small white craft gliding across the water. It wasn't the county sheriff's marine unit. I knew their markings well. This one had bold black letters stenciled on the side, Lake Patrol, Harbor Point HOA. Two men in matching windbreakers sat inside, radioing back and forth like they were running a military operation. They stopped in front of my dock for a moment, one pointing toward my cameras before the boat sped away. The next morning, I saw them again. Different time, same route. They circled the shoreline like they were surveying property lines. Something about it didn't sit right with me. The HOA had never mentioned any lake patrol in its bylaws or budget. It wasn't part of any community announcement either. If they were legitimate, there'd be a paper trail. If not, it meant Grant was running his own private enforcement team. I decided to find out. That weekend, I parked my car near the public access ramp, where most small patrols refueled. Sure enough, the same white boat pulled in around dusk. I crouched low behind my steering wheel, camera in hand, and started recording. The men stepped off the boat and walked toward a warehouse dock behind an old marina. A faded sign above the office door read, Lewis Marine Supply. My stomach dropped. Grant's last name wasn't a coincidence. It was family. His brother, Tom Lewis, had owned the marina for years. Through my camera's zoom, I captured one of the men removing his jacket. His shirt read, Lewis Security Contractors, a company that didn't exist in any official registry. I'd already checked. I recorded as they tied the boat to the dock, laughing about how easy it was to scare homeowners. One of them pulled out a beer from a cooler and said, Grant's right, people back off fast when they think we're the law. That's when the truth hit me. The Lake Patrol wasn't a legal entity at all. It was a prop, an intimidation tactic. HOAs can't act as law enforcement or impose control beyond their property boundaries. They can't create fake security teams or patrol public waters. Everything Grant's men were doing violated both local and state jurisdiction. But rules only matter to people who fear consequences. Grant clearly didn't. I stayed in my car, filming every movement. My hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from adrenaline. I finally had proof that his authority was built on smoke. The men kept talking, their voices carrying across the still water. One, a heavy-set guy with a crew cut, laughed and said, The nurse? Yeah, we made her jumpy as hell. Cameras everywhere now. Grant says she's one more citation away from folding. Hearing my name in their mouths made my blood run cold. They were talking about me like a project, a target, a job that needed finishing. I leaned closer, trying to keep them in frame. Every second of that footage mattered. Then, one of them looked up. I don't know if it was the glint of my camera lens or the reflection off my windshield, but something caught his attention. His face changed, suspicion narrowing his eyes. He nudged the other man and pointed toward the road. I ducked down instantly, heart pounding so hard I could hear it echo in my ears. Footsteps crunched on gravel. A flashlight beam swept across the parking lot, slicing through the dark. I held my breath, willing myself to disappear. The beam passed once, twice, and then stopped. Light flooded my car window, blinding me. A voice broke through the silence, low and certain. "She's right here." For a split second I froze, gripping my camera like it could save me. Then the light flared brighter, and I caught sight of the man's face. Hard eyes, faint grin, the kind of look that said he already knew my name. That night I didn't sleep, because now I knew the truth. The lake wasn't being watched for safety, it was being watched for me. Every lie leaves a paper trail, and I was ready to follow it straight to the source. After what happened with the fake lake patrol, I stopped trusting anything the HOA said. The lake, the bylaws, even the so-called community property lines, none of it felt right. Grant Lewis wasn't just enforcing rules, he was rewriting them. If he could build a security team out of thin air, what else had he fabricated? I decided to find out. The next morning, I drove to the county recorder's office downtown. The building itself looked forgotten. Faded brick, cracked windows, and an American flag that barely moved in the wind. Inside, rows of metal filing cabinets lined the walls like soldiers standing at attention. The air smelled faintly of paper and dust. And somewhere in the back, an old ceiling fan clacked in uneven rhythm. Behind the counter sat a man in his late 40s with glasses perched on the edge of his nose. His name tag read Eddie Ramos, records clerk. When I told him what I was looking for, the original ownership records for Harbor Point Lake, he raised an eyebrow. "That's going back a ways," he said, glancing toward a stack of index cards older than both of us. "What do you need it for?" "Property clarification," I replied carefully. "The HOA's been unclear about jurisdiction." Eddie gave a slow nod, the kind that said he understood more than he let on. "Follow me," he said, motioning me toward the back. We wound through narrow aisles of filing drawers until we reached a dusty cabinet labeled Waterways and Easements, 1965-1980. Eddie pulled open the drawer and flipped through folders until he found one marked Harbor Point Lake Development, 1972. He set the folder on a table and gestured for me to look. The paper was yellowed and brittle, the typewriter ink faded, but still legible. The first line I read made my pulse quicken. Designated public easement, accessible through county-maintained waterways. I looked up at him. "Does this mean the HOA doesn't own the lake?" "Not even close," he said. "This document shows the lake was deeded as a public easement before the community was even built. That means no private entity can legally claim full control." It took a moment for that to sink in. All the threats, the fines, the harassment, Grant's authority had been built on a lie. Eddie pulled out another binder, flipping through pages until he found a note added decades later. "See this?" he said, pointing to an amendment from the late 80s. "This signature's off. Look closely. The county seal here doesn't match the official one from that time period." My heart pounded. "Are you saying this was forged?" "I'm saying someone altered this filing," he replied. "And whoever did it knew exactly what they were doing." Legal nugget under riparian law: any body of water naturally connected to a public stream or river cannot be privately restricted by homeowners association. Even if an HOA borders the lake, they can't revoke access or issue permits for usage. The law protects fair use and prevents exactly this kind of abuse. I flipped through the rest of the folder, page after page of inconsistencies, missing signatures, overwritten lines, maps redrawn to shift boundaries by a few crucial feet. The deeper I looked, the more the truth came into focus. Grant's entire operation rested on a falsified claim of ownership. The HOA had never legally controlled the lake. They had just acted like they did, long enough for everyone to believe it. Eddie leaned closer, lowering his voice. "You just touched something they don't want found," he said. "These records haven't been pulled in over 20 years. The last time someone asked about them, the file went missing for 3 months. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. "Missing?" He nodded. "Be careful, Rachel. You're dealing with people who think they own the law." I took photos of every page with my phone, backing them up instantly. Every shutter click echoed through the quiet office like the ticking of a clock. When I finished, I thanked Eddie, tucked my phone into my bag, and walked toward the exit, my heart beating in uneven bursts. Just as I reached the door, my phone buzzed. I expected it to be Diane, maybe checking in. But when I looked at the screen, the message made my blood run cold. Unknown number. Stop digging, Rachel. You're being watched. I froze in the doorway, fingers gripping the phone so tightly it hurt. The screen dimmed, but the words burned into my mind. Someone knew exactly where I'd been and what I'd found. I stepped outside into the sunlight, but the warmth did nothing to ease the chill spreading through me. The truth was no longer buried in paper, it was alive, and it was watching me back. The first bullet wasn't meant to hit me, it just wanted to scare me. That's what I kept telling myself as I stared at the jagged hole punched clean through the side of my mailbox. The morning sun caught the torn metal, making it glint like an open wound. For a long moment, I just stood there on the gravel path, holding my mail in one hand and trying to steady the tremor in the other. The casing lay nearby, half buried in the dirt. It wasn't kids. Kids don't shoot at houses with purpose. This was a message. When I called the police, the officer barely looked up from his notepad. Probably teenagers, he said, shrugging as if bullets were just another kind of litter. We'll file it as vandalism. Might want to put up some lights. Lights. As if that would stop whoever was out there. He didn't even write down the HOA's name when I mentioned it. I wanted to scream at him, to tell him that this wasn't random, that it had Grant Lewis written all over it, but I didn't. Because the truth was, Grant didn't need to pull the trigger himself. He had people for that. By the end of the week, the mailbox wasn't the only attack. I received 2 official-looking envelopes stamped with the HOA logo. Inside were letters accusing me of non-compliance fines, totaling over $4,000. One line burned into my memory. Failure to remit payment within 15 days may result in foreclosure proceedings. Foreclosure over made-up violations. I read it twice, 3 times, my heartbeat thudding louder with each word. Legal Nugget 5. An HOA cannot foreclose on a property without following a strict judicial process. They must obtain a court order, provide evidence of legitimate debt, and give the homeowner a fair opportunity to contest the charges. Threatening foreclosure through letters or intimidation is not just unethical, it's illegal. I knew that, but knowing didn't make it easier to breathe. Grant wasn't trying to collect money. He was trying to make me break. The harassment spread like rot. Someone left a dead fish on my porch, its scales glinting under the porch light. I started finding my trash cans overturned, and once, the tires of my car had been deflated overnight. When I walked down the street, conversation stopped. Lawnmowers went silent. Even Diane couldn't meet my eyes anymore. The whispers had changed, from sympathy to fear. I became a ghost in my own neighborhood. Curtains moved when I walked by, and sometimes I'd catch a flicker of light in a window across the lake, like someone was watching through binoculars. Nights were worse. Every sound became a threat. The creak of the dock, the whine of the wind, the occasional splash in the water. I stopped sleeping more than a few hours at a time. My cameras caught nothing but shadows, but that almost made it worse. Shadows can't be questioned or confronted. They just linger. I started eating meals standing at the counter, half listening for noises outside. My coffee went cold most mornings. The house, once my refuge, now felt like a cage. The walls carried the tension in my chest, amplifying it until I couldn't tell where I ended and the fear began. My father called after hearing about the mailbox. He's the kind of man who believes in simple truths and hard fights. A retired Coast Guard officer who never learned the meaning of backing down. You can't let him scare you into silence, Rachel, he said. If the police won't help, go public. Make it loud. The idea terrified me as much as it freed me. Going public meant exposure. It meant every lie, every threat, every sleepless night would be dragged into the open for everyone to see. But maybe that's what it would take to make Grant flinch. For weeks, he'd been operating in the shadows, hidden behind board meetings and phony legal letters. What if I turned the spotlight on him? That night, I sat at my desk, reviewing every clip, every document, every piece of proof I'd collected. I started writing a statement, a timeline of harassment and fraud, planning to send it to a local reporter. My hands shook as I typed, not from fear anymore, but from resolve. If Grant wanted a war, I was finally ready to fight one. I was halfway through when headlights flashed across my window. A car rolled slowly up my driveway, tires crunching against the gravel. I stood, heart hammering, and pulled the curtain aside. It wasn't Grant. It wasn't the police, either. A sheriff's deputy stepped out, hat low, a folded envelope in his hand. He didn't say a word until I opened the door. "Rachel Moore?" he asked. "Yes." He handed me the envelope. "You've been served." Inside was a summons. Grant Lewis was suing me for defamation of the HOA. For a moment, the room tilted. After everything he'd done, after the threats, the lies, the fear, he was taking me to court. I looked up at the deputy, who gave a small, apologetic nod before walking back to his car. The sound of his engine faded into the night, leaving only the whisper of wind across the lake. I stood in my doorway, holding the papers that turned my nightmare into an official case. Grant had fired his next shot, and this time, it wasn't through metal. It was through the law. When the law fails you, you learn to speak its language yourself. After the lawsuit papers arrived, I spent 2 sleepless nights sitting at my kitchen table surrounded by binders, printouts, and coffee cups gone cold. Every piece of evidence I'd collected was spread out before me. Recordings, photos, county maps, even the old easement documents Eddie helped me find. I read and reread each line until the legal language started to make sense. Grant had been using intimidation disguised as procedure, bending rules that most people never bothered to understand. But I wasn't most people anymore. If he wanted to use the law as a weapon, then I was going to wield it better than he ever had. The next morning, I drove to the county courthouse and filed a counterclaim. My claim wasn't just a defense against his defamation suit. It was a statement of sovereignty. I cited riparian rights, the legal principle that gives landowners reasonable access to and use of adjoining waters protected by both state and federal law. My property line touched the lake, which meant I had as much legal right to its surface as anyone else in Harbor Point, HOA or not. Grant could threaten, fine, and fabricate all he wanted, but he couldn't rewrite the foundation of state law. I attached copies of the public easement deeds and a detailed timeline of his harassment. The clerk glanced over the paperwork and let out a quiet whistle. "You're not just fighting him," she said. "You're taking on the entire HOA." "I know," I replied, sliding the forms back across the counter. "That's the point." When I got home, I printed a single-page declaration titled Sovereign Access Notice. I laminated it, sealed the edges, and nailed it directly to my dock post where everyone could see it. The words were simple but deliberate. Protected under federal access law. Riparian rights enforced. For the first time in months, I felt something like power returning to me. Not the loud, violent kind Grant thrived on, but the quiet, rooted kind that comes from standing your ground. I watched the notice ripple slightly in the breeze and thought of my husband, of how proud he would have been to see me fighting back. By evening, the whole neighborhood knew. Diane called in a whisper, half impressed, half terrified. "Rachel, what did you do?" "Grant's calling an emergency board meeting. He's furious." "Good," I said. "He should be." Rumors spread faster than wildfire. Some said I'd sued the HOA. Others said I'd hired a federal lawyer. One neighbor told me Grant was pacing outside the clubhouse, red-faced, shouting about insubordination. I pictured him in his pressed shirt and polished shoes, the self-proclaimed emperor of the lake, realizing for the first time that someone wasn't bowing. Still, a sliver of fear crept through me. Power like his doesn't dissolve quietly, it retaliates. That night, I sat on the porch with the lights off, watching the reflection of the moon dance across the water. My notice gleamed faintly at the edge of the dock, the laminated surface catching the pale glow. I told myself that maybe, finally, this battle had reached its peak. that Grant would see the law wasn't on his side and back off. But peace never lasts long around people who mistake control for order. Around midnight, I heard it, the low, steady hum of engines. 1, then 2, then 3. I stepped out onto the deck, barefoot, the boards cool beneath my feet. Down by the water, shadows moved. Boats. They weren't fishing, and they weren't out for a night cruise. Their spotlights flicked on, slicing through the darkness, sweeping across my dock like a search party. I could make out voices over the sound of the motors. Laughter, then someone calling my name. "Nice sign, Rachel," one of them shouted, mocking. Another voice followed, deeper, slower. "Let's see how sovereign she feels when we take that dock down." The motors revved louder, circling in tight arcs, the wakes slapping hard against the shoreline. My notice shook where it was posted, the metal nails groaning against the force of the water. I gripped the railing, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might crack my ribs. In that moment, I understood exactly what Grant was doing. The courtroom was just his stage. This was his message. He wanted me to know that paper might hold words, but fear still held weight. I didn't move. I didn't shout. I just stood there, watching as their boats carved the moonlight into pieces, refusing to step back. Because I'd already decided. This lake wasn't his to control. And I wasn't his to scare. When lawmen show up holding both the law and a threat, you learn which one they serve. It was just past noon when the sound of tires crunching over gravel broke the stillness around my house. I'd been sitting at the kitchen table, my laptop open to the court's case tracker, when I saw the reflection of flashing lights ripple across the water. For one wild second, I thought Grant had finally sent his goons again, but this time, the badge was real. A county sheriff's SUV rolled up my driveway, dust cloud trailing behind it like smoke. Grant Lewis followed right behind in his black truck, stepping out with that same smug posture he wore like armor. I walked outside before they could knock, my laminated sovereign access notice still gleaming on the dock behind me. The sheriff, a broad man with a weathered face and mirrored sunglasses, gave me a cautious nod. "Ma'am," he said, "we've had a complaint regarding unauthorized use of restricted property. I was asked to assist in resolving a trespass issue." "Trespass?" I repeated, disbelief tightening my voice. "This is my property." Grant folded his arms, his tone dripping with superiority. "You're in violation of HOA directives, Sheriff. She's been warned repeatedly. We're exercising board authority to suspend her dock access until the matter is resolved legally." The sheriff shifted his weight, glancing from Grant to me. I could almost see the hesitation flicker behind his sunglasses. "Do you have documentation, ma'am?" I didn't answer with words. I turned, walked back into the house, and returned with a folder I'd been keeping by the door for exactly this reason. Inside were copies of my deed, the county's easement records, and the riparian access code highlighted in yellow. I laid them out across the hood of the sheriff's SUV like cards on a table. The breeze caught the edges, making the pages flutter as I spoke. "My property line extends to the water line. This lake is a designated public easement, filed in 1972. The HOA's claim of private control is invalid. You can confirm it in the county recorder's office." The sheriff leaned in, scanning the documents slowly, methodically. His reflection shifted as he read, his jaw tightening with each line. Grant, growing impatient, stepped closer. "Sheriff, this isn't your concern. The HOA has its own enforcement authority. We've always managed these waters." That was his mistake. The sheriff straightened, folding the papers carefully before handing them back to me. His voice was calm, but his words carried the kind of finality that can cut through arrogance. "You've got no jurisdiction here, Mr. Lewis. HOAs can't enforce bylaws that contradict county or state ordinances. This lake falls under public access law. Unless you have a court order, which I doubt, you're the one trespassing." Grant's expression cracked. "You don't understand," he started, his voice rising. "She's disrupting the community." "I understand perfectly," the sheriff interrupted. "And I'm not your muscle." He turned to me, his tone softening. Ma'am, you're within your rights. I suggest you keep your documents handy, but as far as I'm concerned, this matter's closed. Legal Nugget 7. County sheriffs cannot enforce HOA bylaws unless they align with local ordinances. If an HOA's rule contradicts state or county law, it carries no legal authority, and any enforcement attempt can be challenged on the spot. Grant's jaw worked furiously, his hands clenched at his sides. For the first time he looked smaller, not because he'd stepped back but because someone had finally told him no. The sheriff tipped his hat toward me before returning to his car. Gravel spat from his tires as he drove off, leaving a silence that felt almost sacred. Grant stood there for a long moment, staring at me across the dock. His smile was gone now, replaced with something colder. He stepped forward just enough for his voice to carry over the water. "This isn't over," he said softly, almost like a promise. "You'll wish you never touched my lake." Then he turned and walked away, his reflection rippling and breaking across the surface behind him. Like the calm before a storm I knew hadn't passed yet. If truth is dangerous, then I was done being safe. After the sheriff drove away and Grant's threat hung in the air like smoke, I realized there was only one move left: to bring everything into the light. For months I had been fighting in silence, recording, documenting, surviving. But corruption thrives in darkness, and I wasn't going to hide anymore. So the next morning, I packed every piece of evidence I'd gathered: photos of the fake patrol, forged filings, harassment letters, the county deed scans, and drove into town. Kelly Rhodes was the only journalist in the county with a reputation for fearlessness. She'd exposed 2 councilmen for bribery the year before, and people still whispered her name like a warning. When I called her office, her assistant hesitated, until I mentioned the words, "illegal HOA control of a public lake." 30 minutes later, I was sitting across from her at a coffee shop, my binder spread open between us like a case file ready for trial. Kelly had sharp eyes that missed nothing. She flipped through my pages in silence, occasionally jotting notes on a pad. "You've got forged signatures here," she murmured, tracing her finger along a photocopy. "And these patrol records, these aren't real permits." When she looked up, her voice lowered. "Rachel, do you understand what you have? This isn't just an HOA story. This is public fraud." Hearing it out loud made my pulse race. "They've been threatening me for months, shooting at my house. I filed police reports. No one cared." She met my gaze, steady and calm. "They'll care after this." By the end of the week, the segment was ready. The teaser hit the evening news first. Local homeowners association accused of fraudulent control of public water. My name wasn't mentioned yet, but I didn't need to hear it to know my life was about to change. When the full story aired, it was like watching my own nightmare turn documentary. Drone shots of the lake, voiceover narrating the falsified filings, and photos of Grant Lewis shaking hands with county officials. My footage played too: the fake lake patrol boat, the night Grant stood on my dock, the illegal notices taped to my door. Legal Nugget 8. Fraudulent HOA filings and unauthorized use of community funds can lead to felony charges under state law. Misrepresentation of ownership or misuse of funds for personal gain isn't just civil misconduct. It's a criminal offense that can result in fines, audits, and imprisonment. When the broadcast ended, the phone calls began. Neighbors who'd once avoided my eyes now wanted to talk. Some were furious. "They've been charging us for lake maintenance that doesn't even exist." Others were scared. Grant's threatening to sue anyone who speaks to reporters. The HOA's next meeting was scheduled for Thursday night, and by then, the entire town was buzzing. I drove by the clubhouse that evening, staying just far enough away to watch. The parking lot overflowed with cars. People stood outside holding signs. "No more fraud. Our lake is public. We deserve answers." The sound of shouting carried across the water, a chorus of anger that drowned out years of forced silence. For the first time, Grant Lewis wasn't in control. Kelly's next article hit the paper the following morning, naming every board member who'd signed the falsified documents. Sources within the county confirm an active review of Harbor Point HOA's filings. The story read, Potential criminal charges pending. It was validation, yes, but it also felt like a warning. Every time my phone buzzed, I half expected another anonymous message. That afternoon, I found Diane waiting at my door, tears in her eyes. "You did it," she said. "You actually did it." She hugged me hard, the kind of hug that comes from someone who's been living afraid for too long. But behind her relief, I saw worry. "Grant's not going to take this lying down," she whispered. "He's dangerous when he's cornered." She wasn't wrong. That night I left the windows open, listening to the sound of the lake. The air was unusually still, the kind of silence that feels intentional. I should have felt safe, vindicated even, but instead, I felt watched. Around midnight, I stood to make tea, and as I reached for the switch, the porch light above me burst with a sharp pop. Glass rained across the steps, the darkness outside swallowing the glow in an instant. My breath caught. Somewhere beyond the yard, I heard it, the soft crunch of gravel under a slow, deliberate step. Then another. I froze by the doorway, heart pounding. The sound lingered for a moment, then faded into the night. Whoever it was didn't run. They walked away, unhurried, like someone sending a message I was meant to hear. The truth was out, yes, but so was I. By morning, the story had gone national, and Grant Lewis's kingdom began to crumble. I woke to the sound of my phone buzzing non-stop. Notifications, calls, voicemails, each one louder than the last. The news segment had been picked up by a regional affiliate overnight, and now it was everywhere. HOA president under investigation for fraud. Local board accused of embezzling resident funds. The headlines read like justice finally learning how to shout. From my porch, I could see the reflection of red and blue lights flickering across the lake. County auditors, escorted by sheriff's deputies, were raiding the HOA office. Boxes came out one after another. Files, hard drives, bankers' boxes full of records. I watched through my binoculars as one investigator lifted a folder and shook his head. Even from this distance, I could feel the weight of the truth landing where it belonged. The radio confirmed what I already suspected. The county had uncovered missing funds, forged signatures, and falsified permits. Everything Eddie and I had found, multiplied by years of deceit. Some of the so-called maintenance fees had been rerouted to Lewis Marine Supply, Grant's brother's company. Others had been quietly funneled into consulting expenses under his name. When the auditor's report hit the press, it was like tossing gasoline on an open flame. The people Grant had ruled over for years were suddenly wide awake and furious. By noon, the HOA board had called an emergency meeting, but only 3 members showed up. The rest had already resigned. Grant, cornered at last, refused to step down. He released a short statement claiming the investigation was politically motivated. No one believed him. The next morning, deputies arrived at his door with a warrant for embezzlement and harassment. Cameras followed every second. I watched from my dock as reporters swarmed his property, microphones waving, questions flying like arrows. For months, he'd been the one sending people to my door. Now the whole world was knocking on his. I stood on the shoreline as the sheriff led him down his own driveway in handcuffs. The sun hit the water just right, and for the first time since this all began, the lake looked alive again. Calm. Free. I felt something in my chest loosen, a tension I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. Diane came over later that afternoon, her hair unpinned and her eyes swollen from crying. She didn't bring muffins this time, just a folded piece of paper, a copy of the article printed in the local paper. She handed it to me without a word, then looked out over the lake. "I should have said something sooner," she whispered. I was scared. I put a hand on her shoulder. "We all were," I said. "But you're here now. That's what matters." That evening, neighbors gathered by the dock. People who had once avoided eye contact now standing shoulder to shoulder. Someone brought coffee, another brought cookies. The conversations were quiet but steady. Plans were already being made to form a new committee, one that would operate with transparency, not tyranny. For the first time in a year, I heard laughter ripple across the water, soft but genuine. The air smelled of pine and late summer rain. I closed my eyes and listened, letting the sound of the lake fill the silence that fear had once occupied. For the first time in months, peace didn't feel fragile. It felt earned. Just as the sun dipped below the tree line, my mailbox creaked open. I walked over and found a single envelope resting inside. The return address read, Harbor Point HOA Legal Counsel. My hands trembled as I tore it open. Inside was a letter on heavy paper, neatly typed and signed. It read, In the interest of resolving all pending disputes and avoiding further litigation, the association is prepared to offer you a private settlement of $100,000 in exchange for withdrawal of all claims and public statements. I stared at the number for a long moment, the ink catching the last trace of daylight. After everything they'd done, after every threat, every lie, they thought peace could be bought. 6 months later, I still wake up before dawn, just to make sure the lake is still mine. The mornings are quiet again, but not the uneasy quiet that used to crawl under my skin. This is the kind that breathes. Mist drifts low across the water, the same way it did the day my boat was taken. But now it feels different, like the lake itself has exhaled after holding its breath too long. I walk barefoot along the dock, coffee in hand, the boards cool beneath my feet, the air thick with pine and dew. For the first time in years, peace doesn't feel like a stranger standing at my door. It feels like home. The settlement offer is long gone, shredded, burned, and buried. I didn't want their money. I wanted their accountability, and I got it. Grant Lewis pleaded guilty to fraud and misuse of community funds. The court transcript read like a confession to everything he'd built his little empire on: lies, intimidation, and greed. He stood in front of a judge, the same way he'd once made me stand before his board, and this time, he had no gavel to hide behind. The sentence wasn't long, but it was enough. His name is now a warning, not a weapon. The HOA dissolved soon after, its assets seized, its bylaws stripped of power. Harbor Point is free again, by law and by spirit. The old HOA office is empty now. The sign that once read Community Harmony Through Order lies face down in the weeds. A few of us kept a piece of it, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. Diane hung hers in her garden. Mine sits in the corner of my workshop, right beside a fresh can of blue paint, the same color I used to bring my boat back to life. It took me weeks to restore her. Every plank, every screw, every scar she carried from that day was sanded, sealed, and repainted until she gleamed like she was brand new. I renamed her Sovereign Grace. It felt fitting, because sovereignty isn't about owning land or winning fights. It's about refusing to surrender what's rightfully yours, even when the world tells you to. When I finally pushed her back into the water, the hull cutting clean through the glassy surface, I swear I felt Mark beside me again. The wind shifted, the lake shimmered, and for the first time since he'd been gone, I didn't feel alone. Every now and then, people still stop by to ask about the story. Some bring coffee, others bring questions. They all want to know the same thing: how I kept going when it would have been easier to walk away. The truth is simple. I didn't fight for property. I fought for peace. And peace is something you build, not something you're granted. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this: never assume those in power know the law better than you. Learn it, use it, and stand tall, even when standing alone. Because once you understand the ground beneath your feet and the water that runs beside it, no one can ever take it from you again. As the sun rises over Sovereign Grace, her reflection stretches across the water like a promise kept. The lake is calm, the air still, and the world feels balanced at last. I take a deep breath, the smell of paint and morning mist mixing in the air, and whisper softly to the water, "We made it." Ever dealt with an HOA that thought they owned more than they should? Tell me in the comments. Your story might be the next one I expose. If you believe no homeowner should ever be bullied off their own land, hit that like button and share this story with someone who needs the courage to fight back. Subscribe for more real battles where ordinary people stand up to corruption and win. Because in the end, power only belongs to those who dare to claim it. What would you have done if they'd taken your piece?